Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Bienvenue à toutes et à tous. My name is Martin French, and I'm going to be hosting today's webinar, co-hosting today's webinar. I just want to say a couple of things just before I jump into my hosting duties. One is that we are recording this webinar today, but no participant information is going to show up on the recording. And another logistical thing that I want to highlight is that English closed captioning is available for this talk. If you want to just press the CC button at the bottom of the window to enable it, you can have the closed captioning up on your screen. So let me just briefly introduce myself and then say a few words by way of introduction. So I'm an associate professor with the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at Concordia University. And this year I have the privilege of serving as the interim director of TAG, the Technoculture Art and Games Center. I'm holding down the director's chair while the current director, Rila Khalid, is out on sabbatical, and I am really privileged to be in this interim position because TAG is awesome. TAG is delighted to be bringing you an inspiring talk this morning by Orion D, who is anchoring TAG's global speaker series, Rethinking Playfulness, with our final talk of 2021. Orion, who is on the West Coast, is up early to be with us this morning. So thank you, Orion, very much. I'm going to make a couple of, as I said, opening remarks on behalf of TAG before turning the session over to my co-host, Aurélie Petit, who is one of the amazing graduate student members of TAG, and Aurélie will introduce Orion. So first, Concordia University's territorial acknowledgement. I would like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Of course, working towards decolonization means going beyond reading statements of territorial acknowledgement. So over the years that I've been working to decolonize my own thinking and ways of being, I've had the good fortune to learn from many brilliant Indigenous authors. And if anyone wants to reach out to me for ideas about what to read to help decolonize their own ways of thinking and being, please don't hesitate to connect with me after today's event. Second, I want to say a few words about TAG and a few words of thanks. So TAG is a platform for interdisciplinary collaboration in digital game research and design, housed in the Milieu Institute for Arts, Culture, and Technology here at Concordia University. For TAG members, digital games serve as a collectively recognizable, shared focal object through which we analyze digital culture and the role of technology in everyday life. We draw faculty and students from across the university, including my co-host, Aurélie, who is a PhD candidate in the Film and Moving Images Studies program here at Concordia. Aurélie's research examines online anime fan identity from a critical anti-racist and feminist approach. Before turning the microphone over to Aurélie, I would like to say three quick words of thanks. Thanks to Gina Hara for doing all of the organizational heavy lifting today. Gina is TAG's coordinator and creative director. Thanks to Alexandra as well for with Concordia IITS for also the logistics, managing the logistics of this webinar. Thanks to Dr. Jess Marcotte for suggesting Orion as a speaker, and thanks to the Milieu Institute for funding our speaker series. Aurélie, over to you to introduce our amazing guest speaker, Orion D. Black.
Thank you, Martin, for this very nice introduction. I am really happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to hear Orion's talk this morning. So Orion D. Black is a non-binary queer writer and director based in Seattle. They currently work with CH Media on the Dimension 20 series. Orion previous work include narrative design for tabletop role-playing games. Today, Orion will talk about their game development framework, the circle theory, that helps game designers to think about their work. It is a simple visual tool that can be used to chart out the narrative threads of your favorite media and help you build your own. Please welcome Orion D. Black.
Hi, I'm Orion. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here. I'm up bright and early, just very thankful for the opportunity to share some more circle theory with the world, and want to talk a little bit about what circle theory is and why I created it. Circle theory is a very simple tool that helps you be able to deconstruct or to plan out or chart out not only the story that you might be creating as a game designer or a writer, but also your overall narrative. And a lot of the work that I like to do is I make sure that the things that I create are very bare bones, that things are very easy to understand, so that because a lot of the time when communicating some helpful bits of information or theories or whatever it happens to be, I always want to make sure that it's as accessible as possible. So the thing about circle theory is that it's a visual tool that I will be showing you in just a moment. A lot of the reasons that I ended up creating circle theory come from my game design background. I made a game, Mutants in the Night, that's a tabletop role-playing game that is about intersectionality and the different sorts of oppressed backgrounds of people, how we collect and collaborate under the banner of the mutant allegory. And while I was doing that, I ended up building out the world in a particular structure that sort of illuminated what circle theory ended up becoming. And so it was through game design that I ended up finding and constructing circle theory, but then it was applying circle theory to all sorts of other different pieces of media that made it really interesting to me, that it became something that I wanted to share with other people, because of the depth of using it. It helped me understand the depth of the creative process of my game and why people were enjoying certain aspects of it so much. And then it became something that I could use to identify why other pieces of media were so moving or successful to me on a narrative level, on story pacing, all sorts of different things. So let me hit the share screen button and show you here the famed circle. This looks like a target here. The circles here are broken down into 3 different sizes of circle. The one that is at the center is the character circle. It is this being a visual tool is something that normally, if you were to have it in your own hands, you could write on it, you could fill in boxes, you can chart from place to place. So in the middle of the character circle, I like to say that that is where you list your character's traits and background and the arc concepts, the things that you want to explore within this character, the things that you know about this character, the things that you want to achieve potentially. That is your innermost circle. It's just whoever the main focus of this particular circle is. And so you can choose any sort of character and put them in the middle of the circle and then chart out what their story is, especially if you're doing like an analysis or a review. The second circle is the environment. And with the environment, it is about the physical space, the mental space, emotional space, political space, and everything that surrounds your main character. That environment breaks up into people, places, and states of being. So there are, not only is it every time this person steps out into the world, but it's also the way that the world is constructed around this person that encompasses their environment. What's really important about it is that we are always, as individual people, we're always in communication with our environments because there are so many varying types of them. And so it is a very key and crucial part of the theory to have your environment be something that is interacted with. The third and the largest circle is the status quo, or sometimes I use overwhelming conditions as the way to define this last circle. And that is the largest one, and the one that encompasses everything, because it is the great, usually unchangeable reality of this person's existence, of the world that they live in. It encompasses the reality of their environment, of their character, and it's not always something that is directly interacted with. Like, for example, I am from the United States of America. I always like to tell people that if this is my circle that we're exploring, that my status quo is capitalism. It affects everything in my environment. It affects a lot of things about my character. There are things that are always going to exist that are things that I personally usually quite in stories, in some of the best stories, in my opinion, I can't directly affect the status quo, but it is something that always has an effect on my environment and on the condition of my character. So that is what the overwhelming condition, or the status quo, is, and how it overall affects these circles here that sort of now form a target, 3 circles that you have here. What circle theory does in writing and design is it identifies plot pieces and breaks down their elements to observe the interactions between these circles while considering all contexts of every previous movement between circles. So to sort of help describe what that means, I have this visual tool here, where here we have, I'm just going to grab a line here. Here we have our character, and our character is where we are starting from. If we take a piece of media and we're moving from, okay, we know who our character is and what their ambitions are, or what their fears are, or whatever that happens to be. The first thing that we do is we draw a line between the character and the environment. And by drawing a line between the character and the environment, we are establishing an action, that this is an example of something that is happening between the character and the environment. And this can be as simple as our main character is very shy and has a hard time advocating for themselves. In how does that react with their environment? It's your character is now taking an action, and that action is going to be reflected in this particular plot point. So our character, let's say their environment that they're going to be involved with is like school. So their character goes to school and they are shy. They have a hard time advocating for themselves. And so in class, they have a lot of instances where they don't speak up, where they're called upon, where the specific thing that's going to happen with their environment is going to play off of the pieces of the character that we have established inside of our character circle. So in this way, we are building out what is happening in this story based off of the interactions between these different points. So we have a very simple one where, let's say this character is called upon in school and it's difficult for them to get answers. Very, very simple thing that happens as our first interaction here between our character and the character's environment. Now we go further and we can define the environment as something that, this is where you can choose whether your environment is something that is like, is it antagonistic toward our character? Is it supportive of our character? Is, depending on the things you've listed and what you want the environment to be, how does the environment now end up having an effect on one of these three, well, really one of the other two circles here, whether it has an effect on or has a relationship with that you can display through another interaction between these three circles, between your target. For example, I like to use things in popular media in order to sort of give a stronger understanding of what, of how this can work with things that are a little bit more popular. So like, for example, I use Star Wars fairly often. In Star Wars, our status quo would be that the Empire rules the universe. You know, there's, right at the beginning of the movie, you get the large scroll of the Empire rules the universe, and there's a rebellious force, and there's a kid who's kind of sitting at the center of it that you end up getting to pretty early on into the film. The environment is war and space, really. So there are these two different sort of levels to it. One that is physical, that we can go to the specific locations of where things are, but also in a time of war and rebellion, it is, all actions are taken within reflection of those things. So, for example, we go down to our character, we'll just pick Luke Skywalker, who is our main person, and we will, as an example, talk about how his path in life of his choosing what is he going to do in the future ends up being wanting to be a pilot who's going to end up, you know, being on, in some way involved in the war because he becomes a fighter pilot as his like life goal. So it is in that way that the environment can be more than one particular thing at a time, where it can be that political space or a mental space or physical space. And it doesn't necessarily have to stay any particular one of those things. It can be multiples of those things. So here is an example of how this sort of works in, I use Star Wars as an example of something that is, here's how the circle works, and then I will show you how the circle works more efficiently, or how it can help you recognize the things that you may want to change or better about your design process. So the first thing is that we have this is actually going from the environment to the character, where the world ends up having an effect on Luke. The first thing that we end up getting out of that movie is Princess Leia ends up having information that ends up in the hands of Luke Skywalker, and the way that this world of war has now fallen into his hands, that he is now directly in contact with, ends up becoming something that is sought after and chased after, and Luke has to decide what to do with this now present information of, this is something that I have to get to Obi-Wan Kenobi, who he knows, even if he does not know that he knows him at the time. What's from that point of the environment interacting with our character has to make a choice through a couple of different, I'm just going to throw a little circle right here as the point that when we reach this is showing where the interaction is going from one place to another. We get to a point where you can just take the next part of the story and we're laying it out visually, that the character has to go and find Obi-Wan Kenobi and find out more about how the world and the reality of the things that are happening within it are actually connected to our main character. So the fact that our main character is the son of a Jedi, and the fact that our main character has valuable information for the rebellion, and how a life of being involved in this war is something that cannot be escaped at this point. From here, the environment and the status quo have a brief relationship where what we are investigating at this point is the fact that the Empire rules the entire universe. That's our big overarching unchangeable condition at the moment. In a lot of stories that that are based off of the hero's journey, what the status quo is something that ends up being something that can be changed, altered, or usually engaged with in a way where the main character and the status quo will come to a clash where the character can overwhelm the status quo. That's not always something that I think that personally is a strong basis of world building or story crafting. But in this particular situation, we get to the point where Luke has come to understand that the Empire itself is going to come burn down his home, is going to be involved in his life regardless of how much he decides that his life is going to be involved with it. That is the moment where like it's sort of a call to action in that way, in that your life is forever changed and there's nothing that you can do about it being changed, but how it is going to change is something that can be taken into your own hands. And that's how the status quo falls back to character. Now, the thing about circle theory that is on the analysis side, you can see how this works, is that we're just charting out every different plot point of what happens in the story and seeing where it connects to something else. How it starts with the environment affecting our character, how our character then affects our environment, and how the environment thereby is actually affected by the status quo. Usually doesn't, the status quo usually isn't something that is affected very often or at all. But the reason that circle theory exists is to approach storytelling from a very specific angles. The point is to go from each plot point with your story and the information that you have about your character, environment, status quo, and to make decisions that are informed based on not only the elements that you've written within these circles, the things that you want to describe these circles as, define them as, but also by each individual action, so that the things that are happening are built on top of each other in order to build a stronger structural narrative and a more realistic and rich world building experience. So you'll go back and take a look at something that's a little bit different, because within the Star Wars story, that's just an analysis. It's a way to take a look at a story and go, okay, here, this is how it is working, and hopefully now you have an understanding of how the circles work. When it comes to world building, there is a way in which, if we're not taking like an existing story and trying to analyze it and break it down and take take note of the things that we like or dislike about these particular actions or choices. In world building, I'm going to take an example of Mutants in the Night, the world that I created for the game that I created, and show you how through game design and through tabletop role-playing games, it was identified that the structure of world building, the structure of story creation that happens with tabletop role-playing games is unique because it inherently has the structure of each individual point of creation between one element and another starts to build the overall world before you're even actually playing the game, quote unquote. Because at that point, every decision that is being made affects something else within that world. And whenever somebody makes a choice as to how they're going to involve one part of their target with another, gives you another piece of the structure by which you will begin to play inside once the game technically begins. And that structure of doing that in tabletop role-playing games is actually a structure that makes very strong and impactful stories in general. So, for example, in the world of Mutants in the Night, I'll give us a small breakdown. It's just in the near future, 10% of human beings become mutants. Those mutants end up, those mutants end up being brought over to different mutant safe zones, which are basically just the ghettos of major cities, and they're kept within these large areas where their own sort of cultures begin to brew, and they have a lot less resources and don't have all of the rights that normal humans do. And so inside of that world, our status quo is that mutants don't have the same rights as other people, as normal humans. You are like confined to your mutant safe zone. You are confined to certain types of jobs. You can only leave with certain permits and all sorts of things. Because it is an exploration of people's different forms of backgrounds of oppression and the beauty of the culture that exists inside of our own individual worlds, and how communities also end up building together in order to make beautiful things out of horrible situations. So our status quo is the human rights issue or the mutants' rights issue, but our environment is something that people get to begin working on and building together. They're given what I told you previously, how there is a oppressive environment surrounding them, and there's a mental level of how much people have been sort of downtrodden, but that environment is also, that's only a piece of the environment being provided to the players, whereas the players then get to decide and to build what parts of that environment are they interacting with on a positive level. They can also choose what parts of the environment they're interacting with on a negative level. But let's get into drawing some lines here. We know what the status quo is. This is building from the outside. You can really start from anywhere. It's dependent on the structure of your own story. But from the status quo, mutant rights being something that is constantly at war, really, trying to obtain mutant rights for the people, and being stuck inside of the mutant safe zone. Now, what kind of environment is born from that, right? There are pre-existing things that I put inside of the game, of course, that have the environment give options as to what are the children doing? What are the more political revolutionaries doing? What is the infrastructure like? What is the situation with hospitals and with mutual aid and care? Like, all of these things become affected by the facts that are presented from the lack of rights. So initially, the first thing that all of these things share, because there are a few different areas that are defined, is that they're all under-resourced. So the engagement here is that because of the status quo, our environment is under-resourced, and everything that we're going to be involved with in our environment is about being under-resourced. But when there's under-resourcement, when an area is under-resourced, there's going to be one that's going to affect your characters in a particular way, that being that your characters are not going to have in the traditional way that people have things unless you go through community building. Because whenever there are less resources, people have to come together and decide how they are going to participate and help define and grow systems that they have to create then on their own for the most part, or to help current systems evolve and grow into something that can be more beneficial for more people. So in this building process, we've already established our status quo environment, and we're actually not going to define our character here, because this is an example of like a tabletop role-playing game situation where people's characters are going to be making more choices on their own level, and then those characters are going to be not only those characters, but those players are going to be using their character to help define the environment and to help define, or at least to provide different perspectives on what our status quo is like. In this way, what I really found about this process, and by using circle theory in this way, is that if you look at the difference between Star Wars, which we used earlier, and what we're doing now with the tabletop role-playing game, is that one, of course, is an analysis of another, of like another property, of another story that already exists. But the way that that story is built using the overarching concepts and ideas of what the storyteller wants to happen in the story overall, and how each one of those beats is just to get to the next part of the story, which isn't a negative way to, isn't necessarily like a lesser way to make stories or anything of the sort. Like, whatever tool that you use, if it works, it works. And that's the beauty of writing, is there are rules, and all rules are made to be broken. But the particular way that I think people can learn to make stronger stories is by going through the process that is more similar to that of tabletop role-playing game creation or design, where we move from our status quo to our environment or character, or within any of these different levels. And each one makes an impact on the other with each individual interaction that they have, forever changing those internal levels. So, for example, we have things written about, we will make a fake character very quickly, where this character is, we know a few things about them already, and we know some really deep and rich things about our character already, just based on the status quo and the environment, before we have even established anything about our character, because we know that they have less rights than a normal human being, that the environment is about, they don't have very much of whatever it is, not a lot of resources, but we know that there is a strong community factor. And so what's posited here, I could use a tissue, actually. I'm sniffing a little bit. But what's posited here is that we have a character who already has elements of the world outside of them affecting them in a way that are very personal and in a way that has made their environment rich. Whereas if you look at the way that in Star Wars, for an example, we go from our status quo to our environment, we know that there is war, but we don't see how war has affected the world surrounding Luke Skywalker. We've more so seen how war has affected his personal decision making once information is presented to him. His actual personal life of how the world is structured around him, how his farm is affected by the war of the Galactic Imperials. There actually isn't a lot of information as to how those things have processed. We get only his own personal story. And so the world around him isn't nearly as rich or involved with the things that we've seen presented overall, except for the fact that there is a threat of death, a general looming threat of death. I wanted to continue talking about from here the involvement of what circle theory is really starting to show with something like Mutants in the Night. And it's that stories can become a lot stronger when you give your characters, when you give your environment, when you give your world more options, more life, by having those characters, having the environment react based off of, reacted more than one way as to how, what their relationship is like. Because that's what happens every time you take an action, is that you're building a relationship between each one of these elements that should continue to give context to each one of those elements together. So, as I was saying, our status quo is that we don't have mutant rights. We have limited, altered human rights for our mutants in an environment that is sanctioned away from everybody else, like sectioned off from everybody else. And we already know about our character that if they exist in this world, that they must be harbored by community in some way, that the way that they involve themselves in the world, like we pose questions toward people in the space of a tabletop role-playing game, but in a story that you're writing on your own, we're posing questions toward our characters, and posing those questions, I mean, even to the environment and to the status quo as well, but right now posing our question toward the character of, if you live in this world, what about yourself ends up interacting with this world in positive and negative ways? And the particulars of what kind of interaction you decide to have are based on what you want your narrative to be. So our overall is, let's say you want your narrative to be something focused on how an individual can get lost in the sort of mad shuffle of large communities that don't have resources, how people can fall through the cracks, then we know that we can frame our character and their interactions around those two basic things. So our main character is somebody who, if there's someone who sort of slips through the cracks, is someone who definitely isn't involved in whatever form of resource management that exists like within this world, and or the system of resource management and distribution is a failure to this person. So in the world of Mutants in the Night, there are these characters called the Littles, and the Littles are just these a bunch of children who have exactly that experience. They all work together they're all under 13 years old. They live in a big old arcade, and they work together to find themselves food and work, and to live for as long as they possibly can until they become adults. And then when they turn 13, they're then a teenager and then have to go out into the world and find work in a different way. Now, if we go from where we're at here with our status quo environment character, and our character is now a little, or maybe even a former little, we have a conversation now about how the elements we've already set up are affecting this character. They've been isolated from parenthood, or traditional parenthood, I should say. But also, how does this character survive within their environment? What are the things that they do in order to have food, in order to have friends, in order to what sort of vices do they have? What sort of relationship do they have in a world that, as we've established up to this point, on a small scale, they are not very well protected or taken care of by anyone other than a small group of small people. But then on a scale where they don't have a lot of rights and they don't live in a space where their care is something that is facilitated by anything like a school or like community centers, things like that children usually end up having in their communities in order to have some sort of protection, learning, things like that. So the reaction that we have from our character onward, once we've made a choice about our character, is that we are going from a place of sort of wanting for something more, wanting for an opportunity to have instead of having been have not for however long. And how does that work out in our particular environment? Now, we've already constructed up to this point a level of depth with this character that is based purely on the facts of what we have presented beforehand. And now the character development is much more rich than in comparison to what we had with Star Wars, because each one of these things, it's being built. This story so far is being built only with the current information and every previous step of the story in mind, as to when you're making a decision as to where to go next. That basis is only, it's not based off of future plans. It's not based off of how many steps are going to be in this person's journey. It is the basis of creating as you go, but with every step you turn back and look at all of the elements of creation that you have brought forward up to this point, so that when you are making a decision, it is an informed decision. And that informed decision has a lot of depth to it, because you can see each one of the different choices that you have made up to this point. And when you make a new decision, like the environment becomes something that is hostile to this child, because this child doesn't have any particular skills that are helpful to, in comparison to, say, some of the other children, someone who has the ability to, I don't know, get into small places or steal stuff or defend others, whatever it happens to be, that we end up going back to our character, and our character now having a sense that they are not wanted or prepared or as valuable in this world that they've created up to this point. But that result is a result of what we can see here is our status quo, because the whole basis of the narrative that we have set up of look at the problems of the oppression, the lesser rights, how that is broken down into the environment, how you show that in someone's environment, and now how this affects one particular character, and how during their personal journey they're running into the exact issue that we're trying to highlight here, is that not only that this character has a lack of skill in a world that only harbors value over particular skills, but because they don't have the rights or the rights, a helpful environment or resources that allow them to thrive as a child should thrive, we now end up having a through line between our character's deepest issues and what our world's deepest issues are. And if you look back at Star Wars, our world's deepest issue is that there is a war, that we are in a state of war. But that state of war and the relationship that Luke Skywalker has with himself and the world around him is not a state of war. It is actually, for him, it is the choice of whether to take part in the world or not. He doesn't actually have to take part in the world as it is. He can choose at many times throughout the story to not be involved, especially early on, but makes the choice to become involved. And in that way, it is setting him up as like a hero character who decides to go and help and save the day and all that, which is fine, but lacks some of the depth of each one of the decisions that have been made up to a particular point in a character's story or in your overarching story, that the through line there doesn't exist nearly as strongly. It really is just like things that are happening that we're charting out that have happened between the status quo environment and the character, but those things are not informed by the past choices of those other things in ways that are strong enough for us to see the reflection of our narrative in our character, enough to see how the relationship between the character and our status quo continue to interact and fight against each other, or what relationship they have with each other. So that is the basis of circle theory, is that using active building relationships and using every prior piece of a story in order to push your stories into places where they have more tangible effect upon each other, and where all of these actions, all of the interactions between your status quo environment and character are building towards a stronger narrative, rather than just having events that are happening because you're trying to get to a particular place or have a particular thing happen. Whereas if you have those events or certain things, particulars that you want to happen within a story, that's built into the status quo environment and character relationships, rather than just as an event that happens. Like, for example, in this story of Mutants in the Night, the overall narrative is about oppression. And so everything that is going to happen, if we construct oppressive systems within our status quo environment and how they affect our character, even within the character, what sort of oppressive systems are there mentally or physically, then we have a continuous conversation about that narrative, rather than having events that happen that could potentially involve that narrative or not. So hopefully that makes sense. Excuse me. That's the basis of circle theory, and it's a very visual exploration of how you can continue to chart over time. For example, just to do some quick putting together, is what is the character's relationship with the status quo at this point, and how does that individual interaction show the overall issue that this character is having? Well, the status quo is that they don't have enough rights, is that regardless at the end of the day, even if inside of their own environment, they start to gain more, if they gain more resources, if they gained more, community, does that change the fact that they're always going to have less unless they fix the actual main issue, or if the main issue is actually addressed? And is that something that can even be done? And if not, what inside, how does the environment react to a situation where there is a person who is frustrated with the fact that they cannot change the greatest issue of their life? What in their environment can they change in order for that environment to be altered enough for this person to have the things that they feel that they don't have? And now you see that each one of these lines is a question that's being posed to another part of our target here, specifically so that when these questions are asked, that we are answering them, so that each interaction is a question that's being answered, rather than just another step towards some event that we want to happen. And I think that's a decent place to stop and go through some Q&A. If people have questions, I see some questions have been coming in. Hopefully this makes sense to you. I try and do this as bare bones as possible. There are always ways that I highly suggest using stuff like this, for using circle theory to analyze stories that you like a lot and see where what those interactions particularly are between one event and another. Because whenever we have stories that we deeply engage with and have strong connections to, being able to identify how an author or a game designer or creator ended up forging a strong connection between one element of something and another, and how that developed into a strong character or plot point or environment or condition that led to a lot of these things, is really important to be able to identify, so that you can then do that yourself, or find other media that shares those kinds of principles, either for your personal enjoyment or for creation of your own. So Q&A whenever you feel like getting into it.
Okay, are you done?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you so much. It was really, really fascinating. Like, I really caught myself at multiple occasions, trying to apply it to stories I have been watching and reading. So, and this is the goal of it. So it was really great. And so before we go into the Q&A, like I see we already have a couple of questions. I'm just gonna kick it off by asking my question, which is, why did you choose the circle, like both as a shape and like, as like a discourse almost? Because I can see it as, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but as a very good way to also like prevent yourself from being trapped narratively into just one level of the story. Like, a lot of people are going to spend too much time talking about the character without ever like getting to a point. So do you think this is one of the aspects of it?
Yeah. I as a circle, there's something that I didn't particularly mention, but when we went from our character circle to our status quo out here, that like you can't do that without actually crossing over your environment. And so having these things positioned in the way that they are makes it that you can really see that like the relationships are in a particular position with each other, and that every time something crosses over with something else, or a point is made from one to another, that you're then given the option to go, okay, how many questions have I been asking about, like you said, the character and their environment, and how much am I interacting with the status quo of it? Like, how am I drawing back to our narrative, or like, how am I making sure that what I'm creating on this small scale is a reflection of what's happening on this larger scale? And so it being something that like has to interact with with itself by crossing over the lines is something that I wanted to, very purposefully wanted it to have.
No, thank you. It's a really great answer. So maybe we can start the question. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Orion. This is fantastic, and I was thinking as well about, you know, I write a lot of nonfiction as well, so this is really also helpful for me thinking about, you know, how I tell you know, narratives, research narratives that I'm kind of constructing as well. This is brilliant. It's like elegantly kind of like simple, but giving you these levels of complexity to think with. So thank you. It's so wonderful. We're getting yeah, some questions. This one came in kind of as you were talking. So and I think in some ways you addressed it, but maybe you could just extend the reflection a little bit. This is from Benoni, who is asking, how do you reflect the effects of circle theory into your plotting? So maybe it's a question specifically about, like, you know, strategies for mapping out, you know, the specific plot points, whether, you know, because you did say that you could start really like anywhere. You could start character, environment, or status quo. Like, do you have different sort of strategies for kind of constructing your plot points?
Yeah. So this is the funny part is this morning when I was getting ready, I was like, oh, circle theory 102 is multi-circle theory. But each one of these can kind of be its own world of interaction between plot points, if you have major plot points that you want to get through. Because I do think that charting out overall plot points is like a great idea. It's still a very functional way to do things, and that like it can be extremely helpful. That each one of these can be an individual. For example, if we know that what this character's journey is right now within the target that we've created, that this is about them finding and having a relationship with the fact that there are lesser resources and they have less rights, and so they have slipped through the cracks, that if there's a plot point at some point that we know, because we have structured narratively, that everything inside of here is going to be sound within the overall context of that particular type of like oppressive lifestyle, that we do know that at least we can connect it to an event of this person is going to react to that reality. They're going to, at some point, learn something about themselves or the world, and they're going to make a decision, which is going to be a question that at any of these points that you feel is comfortable, really just branches into, like, you could just draw a line from this major center into another one that is, okay, this is the next chunk of time, this is the next like bundle of interactions as to where like your next plot point happens. So if it's like eventually this person is going to like start their own Little's gang or something like that, or if they're going to try and like in Mutants of the Night, you have powers and you do your best to try and affect the overall world. But if this is even just like the character creation aspect of a character, and that your next circle is, these are the plot points that are going to happen individually of what are the things that I'm going to write down as like each line being a chapter or whatever it happens to be, is that this is a very micro version that you can turn into something that is much more macro. And like this individual one could even just be your notes on a character's individual journey up to the beginning point, or even in the same way, this could be their middle point. It could be an end point that gets into the specifics of their story. But if you think of each circle of itself as a plot point that you can further investigate with the details of each one of these interactions, you can have a whole lot of circles going on that just are connected to each other based off of how you want to organize it, however it is visually the most sensical for you to organize it.
That's awesome, and such a good way as well to think about like the visualization possibilities of circle theory, right? In terms of mapping out, you know, storyboarding, I guess, right? Storyboarding your narratives. That's wonderful. Okay, this one, this is a question from Narf that I think is resonating with me as well. And it is, do you recommend circle theory primarily for helping to initially, oh, sorry, wait a second. Sorry, the question jumped. Sorry about that. I was reading the wrong question. The next question, which you got a foreshadow of, could you tell me maybe a situation where you were narratively blocked? This is why this question is resonating with me, because yeah, sometimes I get stuck in my, you know, kind of story construction and writing. So could you tell me about a situation where you were narratively blocked and circle theory helped you to see a problem or find a solution?
Yes, absolutely. So this is circle theory is actually just like this sort of grinded down simplistic version of how I create things when I do my writing. And what's important to me when I'm writing is that the world has enough context so that for those who are visual thinkers, which is like 50% of people, imagine like a painting, and your painting has characters inside of it. It has like a painting is a snapshot of time, right? So let's say there are like people walking down the street and you have particular characters, and as you start to give those characters backgrounds and likes and dislikes and all sorts of things, the painting starts to move. And so you know how this character walks a little bit, you know what they're talking to another person about, or what kind of music they're listening to. You can start to fill in these blanks, and so for those who are visual thinkers, there is a movement that begins as to because the world comes to life in that way. And for me, all of these charting out all of these different parts and making it so that there are all of these past events and interactions, and there's a relationship being built up to a particular point, that when everything sort of, when you've built out enough pieces of it, those are the details that, like in that picture, you're starting to fill in about the characters and the environment and all that sort of thing, that start to give them life and start to move them around. And so for circle theory, it always becomes, what question can I pose in this to this picture, to this situation, that's going to get it to move, you know? So if people are like walking across the street to the other side of the street and two people are having a conversation, and I'm all of a sudden stuck as to, okay, where are they going next? Or where is this conversation going? What are they talking about? What's happening surrounding these people? Those are all questions posed to involve themselves with, like in the target here, with the character and the environment and the world at large, as to posing a question as to one of those three things, posing a question to one of those three things, to keep things moving, to keep a momentum. Each time it's like, well, my character goes to bed and has succeeded in a thing today, that's awesome. But when they wake up the next day, let's say this character has literally nothing to do, the world around them should still be moving and functioning, and there should be things happening. And the way that circle theory builds it is that you should have relationships built in to the world itself, to where that life that surrounds your character or surrounds your plot should have enough going on. You can always turn to it as an answer to go, oh, I know that my character is supposed to be doing these things, but I want my character to get to the point where they're going to have a revelation about something. How are they going to meet that? Like, I've just met this like overall issue. Well, how in the world that we live in, that we grow in, does something about the status quo of our lives turn into the news that we consume in a day, that turns into how we feel about something and how we then decide to take an action, or how that news goes and affects a friend of ours, and our friend ends up having a different perspective or something that they bring to us today, or even how sometimes in like some very wild situations, our environment even does end up changing the status quo in some absolutely absurd and massive way that then resonates outward to everyone. And so what this just came to me, but I think about it as like the circles being the ripples of when you drop like the rock into the water, and how everything is going to affect everything else. So as soon as something decides that it is done affecting something, it is still going to be affected, as long as you have a structure where the relationships between all of these things are living and breathing. So they're basing each other off of themselves.
Oh, that's such a wonderful metaphor. And actually, I'm gonna leap ahead in the question series or comment series, because we got a comment from Rila. Hi, Rila. Thanks for joining. Even though you're on sabbatical, great to see you here. It's basically just a comment about how the circle is also kind of reminding us of the circularity of time and shaking up the notion of, like, I guess, life or character progression as a unidirectional path. Your kind of ripples metaphor, I think, wonderfully gets us to think and imagine the dynamism of these relationships.
Mm-hmm. It's you could even think of it that every point where there's an interaction is another place where ripples are coming out and bouncing off against the walls of the circles. And that's where you can always find and reach toward, has this effect, how is this particular interaction something that I can grab onto and like explore.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Now, this is a question from Owen. I want to maybe riff on it a little bit. So Owen has asked, like, and I think it's maybe, or how I'm wanting to riff on it is maybe just to ask about your own process. So the question is, do you recommend circle theory primarily for initially developing a character, or for ongoing kind of story development? And I think, like, in your talk, we're hearing both and, but yeah, how do you start? Do you kind of like, Mutants in the Night, like, does this come, for example, from like thinking of a character first, or did kind of circle theory sort of, what was the sort of like process, I guess, your relation to circle theory and like developing characters and stories?
Yeah, for me, it's a little chaotic. Like, this is the the boiled down version to share with people, but I sort of start in. So, for example, I will tell you how I created Mutants in the Night. Hopefully, that'll give some context. But I wanted to make a game that was specifically about, that was like, here is a world where I will fantasize what a like post-oppressed world looks like. And I thought about it and I went, I can't do that because I live in an oppressed world. Like, I only know the things that I know, and I'm not at a point where like I can get to that world yet. And so I said, okay, how do I create a world that reflects the world that I'm in so that I can explore that world? And then after understanding it, then find that fantasy of what it is like post a world like that. So I created, I saw the mutant metaphor, like I thought about a lot of different stories about oppression, and I saw the mutant metaphor and I went, wait, that's perfect, because people's individual, the differences between people and the different ways that each person experiences oppression come from all of these like axes of visibility, non-visibility, what's internalized, what's based on the law and structure of all these sorts of things. And I took from the real world in order to create all of that. But for me, as long as once I understand the status quo, then I can create an environment and a character in that order. It's probably the easiest way for me to create things, because for me, it's about the overarching narrative. And so if I approach it from that level first, then like I said, it's like the creating of a painting is that I know how the world outside of this painting is working. Like I can extend that painting outward and continue to draw and paint, and create a world where it's like, well, these are the things that are just happening in this place, because as long as there is a life to it, as long as I can pose the same questions to any situation that is possibly happening, if it's our main characters are walking down the street or crossing the street and listening to music and talking to each other, what's happening 3 blocks away at a food place? Okay, well, this food place is going to be a fusion food place because in the mutants world, you're from all over different parts of the world who you get sent to these mutant safe zones. So the food is going to be like, there's going to be a Chinese place and there's going to be an Indian burrito place right next to it or something like that. Like I can know that because of building out the world in place of what the environment is like without having been involved with the characters at all. Those characters are wherever. And if at any point they go to our Indian burrito place, like there's interaction. I know that there's life there. I know that there's stuff that can go on. But for me, it's about having the world outside of the actual story be living and breathing, but that's only through having the narrative through line at the beginning that like holds it all together. So if I had to give it like a ranking, I would say that it definitely starts with status quo for me, and then the environment, and then characters. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for like lifting up the veil a little bit and letting us see your process. That's amazing. I want to read this question from Jess Marcotte now, which is about, yeah, I think this is a really interesting question about kind of maybe the temporality or the rhythm or the pacing of a narrative. So Jess is asking, or saying, I would love to hear more of your thoughts on resisting the impulse to blow up the stakes of a story until it's always about saving the world from destruction or altering the status quo in a major way, a la Star Wars or Final Fantasy.
Yeah, no, that is absolutely great, because I love Star Wars and I even more love Final Fantasy. I grew up on Final Fantasy stories, and they are a part of why during my early years, like I resonated with books a lot, but then I'm a big video game person. So it's fun to me because one of my friends is a teacher, and she also loves Final Fantasy, and we always say that the goal of Final Fantasy is to fight and defeat God, which it almost always is. For some reason, everything just swoops into like, you're literally fighting God now. And it is such a hilarious thing that for people like me and my friend who make stories like this, that we're just like, oh, I love it. Just like, give me that God fighting goodness. But it is also the thing that is like the biggest bane of my enjoyment of a lot of stories, is that a lot of the time we go, swoop, let's go and go, okay, well, now the status quo itself, we're going to go and challenge it. This is the character of prophecy who's going to go and change everything. So excellent question. What really makes it strong for me to avoid that, what makes it so possible, is that circle theory works against that by nature. It is about looking back at what happened previously and making a decision based on the existing relationships, rather than on some like guiding principle or like pushing something to happen because it would be cool to happen. playing a lot of Final Fantasy games, there are plenty of times inside of those games where there are these great relationships going on between characters and why they are struggling against each other, or these great powers, kings and queens and whatnot, who are struggling against each other. And then all of a sudden, it's probably why it's so fun, because there's this huge elongation to where it's all of a sudden, you know, some god is involved or something, and the whole time there's been something here, and that's just like hilarious and fun. But it's easy to resist that urge when the world starts to contain itself and be considerate of only the elements of its own world, because anything that you bring in from the outside is going to be it's going to feel unnatural by the way that you work inside of the circles of circle theory. It's really like coming in with a meteor and just throwing something down and go, okay, now this person's going to destroy the status quo. It's like, okay, well, if they're going to destroy it or change it or whatever it is, then I don't think that's always necessarily a bad thing, because there are some stories that I really enjoy that have the status quo change. But when that happens, I think you have to understand that when it does, that means that your environment changes and your character changes. And if that's the reason that you're going to change the status quo, then I think do it. Like, absolutely go ham. If you want the environment to change and your character to change the status quo. If you want if you want any element to change, go ahead, like do it and like mix it up and everything. But I think that just by this process, it'll be much more informed on why you want those things to happen, rather than that seems like a cool thing to do. Because there's always a better way to, like, going to fight God or whatever it happens to be, or to destroy the very overwhelming circumstance of the world, is just a macro version of a micro thing. So you can find that micro version that is much more intimate and much more aligned with everything that you've written down and experienced up to this point, that is going to have a stronger effect, because it's something that is detailed and connected to everything else, rather than just the largest version of that thing that has the least amount of connection to most other things.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. I love also, you know, I guess the mutability, or the plasticity maybe of circles. Like, in a way they are like dynamic and fluid, but they also remind us about containment and containers, you know. So I think that's such a great way that they can work as well. I think we've got time for about one more question and response. So this one is also from Jess, just asking whether we can read, if there are other places where we can read or hear you talk about multi-circle theory, and also maybe just telling the audience where we can get Mutants in the Night.
You can get Mutants in the Night at oriondblack.itch.io. That is where my 2 games are. I made 2 games and then I stopped game designing. Who knows what'll happen in the future. But you can purchase Mutants in the Night there if you would like to. It's a fun read, honestly. I recommend just reading that game if you have gone through Circle Theory and you really like it. Then reading Mutants in the Night is like a really strong parallel to go like, oh, I totally get this. But there currently aren't any talks on multi-circle theory. It's something that I have been thinking about working on, because it would take like multiple diagrams and a couple of things. And so some people have talked to me about like actually getting a like PowerPoint presentation going and everything. So there will be at some point. There's continued to be more interest about circle theory the more that I talk about it at like colleges and stuff. So you're giving me reason to expand upon making more. So thank you. I don't think that there's there's one video of me doing a circle theory talk at another college on YouTube somewhere, but I think that everything that I've said there, I have said here at about the same. So there isn't a whole lot out there, but being that there is more demand, there will be more.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Orion. Aurélie, I know you had a number of good questions as well. You got to pose one. Did you want to, we have like really very couple of minutes left if you wanted to ask a last quick question. But either way, if you could come back in on the screen so we can thank Orion.
Okay. Well, I have very long questions, so I think I had ones that were, you know, more or less building out on Jess' comment, you know, about like how do you apply the circle theory to like slice of life stories, which doesn't really involve like, you know, conflict situationship. So, but I mean, I think you also answered it. So, you know, unless you want to build a bit upon this again, but
just a bit, sure. Honestly, I think that works even better because it's all about relationships. A really brief example, I love using Dragon Ball Z as an example because I think that Dragon Ball Z has some of the worst and best storytelling. But there's a situation where I think that like Goku in Dragon Ball Z has some of the worst storytelling just ever. Love the guy. Vegeta has some of the best storytelling ever. But the relationships within Vegeta's, when I do an analysis of Vegeta's storylines within this are heavily based on the relationships he has with people and almost nothing to do with the fighting that goes on in the show, which is the vast majority of the show. And I think that it is one of the most poignant stories even just to have going through that, which is really just the reactions to Goku and to the ideas of strength and being the strongest, all this sort of stuff, and what it really is about family and belonging and all of that. Like it's so much better of a fit in that category than it even is about something that is like more conflicting in a like wartime sense or a combat sense.
Thank you. I do agree. I think you should write a paper about how Dragon Ball is a slice of life anime.
It is such a good one. If you take it as a slice of life, it's quality right there.
I mean, so many of the stories depend on the relationship they have, you know, between each other. So, and you know, even Vegeta, like his entire like story is involved about his relationship with Bulma and like Trunks and everything. Okay, I wait for this paper now. But so I think we can conclude if it's fine with both you and Martin.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Well, on my part, Orion, did you have any last words that you wanted to say?
I just want to say thank you for having me. Hopefully this was enlightening and helpful to you all, and there will be more circle theory stuff in the future. Probably when I'm on break from work and I have some time to get into some more details about multi-circle theory.
Well, this was totally awesome. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. Getting up early. It's still dark, I think, even maybe now on the West Coast.
The light is out.
Okay.
The sun is out now.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today for this wonderful talk. Being so generous with the engagement with our questions. The one sort of bad thing about doing this stuff on Zoom, these webinars, is that you can't hear a round of applause at the end of this. But I'm applauding. Aurélie is applauding. All the participants are applauding. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this. And we'll wish you a great day and look forward to hearing more about circle and multi-circle theory.
Thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to @ me on Twitter at Orion D Black. I will probably answer them.
Thank you so much. Okay, wonderful. Thanks everybody for joining us today as well. Yeah, wow. Wishing everybody a good end of 2021, which is approaching. Thanks and have a great day, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye.